I want to start with just a brief articulation of some of the arguments I put forward in the book. First is that I argue that normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam after 1975 was a process, that it was a protracted, highly contentious process, not a moment in the 1990s when President Bill Clinton announces diplomatic relations normalized in July of 1995. And a second key argument of mine is that normalization, that is thawing of relations between the governments spearheaded in Washington and Hanoi, and the process of resettling over 1 million Vietnamese refugees in the United States, that these were not merely simultaneous developments, but they were mutually constitutive, that negotiating migration programs became one of the primary means through which the United States and Vietnam normalized relations. And in this sort of brief, very informal format, I thought sort of taking the journalistic who, what, when, where, why approach to kind of develop these each a little more might be beneficial. So I want to start with the when. As a scholar of US foreign relations, the chronology here is very important. I organize my book into 3 parts, arguing that that normalization occurs over a 3-part process. But more broadly, I start where most histories of the Vietnam War end, in April of 1975. And I take very seriously the scholarship of critical refugee studies scholars, which posits, among other things, that first South Vietnam persisted beyond April 1975, as in Long Tu Boy's very elegant phrase, as a ghost nation that was carried forward by the diaspora. So that is, even though there is no longer a South Vietnamese state, there's still a South Vietnamese nation. And second, that the war might have been over for the United States, if not in April of 1975, perhaps even in January of 1973, with the Peace of Paris Accords that brought US troops back to the United States, but that the war continued for the Vietnamese people, and especially for the South Vietnamese, in re-education camps, on the high seas, in refugee camps, and through the ongoing hardships of family separation that were endemic therein. So one of my main interventions in the book is to contribute to scholars like Mary Dudziak, who argue that war and peace are not nearly as simple as they appear at first glance. And in the book, I suggest that between these sort of 2 moments, the fall of Saigon on the one hand and the announcement of the resumption of full relations on the other, that war and peace coexisted uneasily, and that they were entangled rather than opposed. So who, when we think about normalization historically, we tend to think of diplomacy at the highest level. Nixon's opening to China, Clinton's announcement on the previous slide, the Obama-Castro handshake, normalization in the American context is almost synonymous with presidential level diplomacy. But I argue if we keep our focus on the White House, we miss the much bigger picture. So in the book, I foreground individuals who I call non-executive actors, US officials outside of the White House, especially members of Congress, and their non-state allies. And in terms of non-governmental organizations, the 2 that are most prominent in the book, and where my original research is most prominent, are the Families of Vietnamese Political Prisoners Association and the Aurora Foundation. And both of these organizations are headed by women who are born outside of the United States, who use transnational networks. In Janetta Saigon's case, human rights activism and methods, and in Cook Minh Thu's case, what one newspaper dubbed the Vietnamese grapevine, networks throughout the diaspora and using a language of family reunification to lobby very successfully on behalf of their loved ones. I argue that these two organizations are the most deserve the lion's share of the credit when we seek to understand how and why the release and resettlement of re-education camp detainees became such a primary pillar of US diplomacy. So here's just some photos of these non-executive alliances, Cook Minh Do with Senators Bob Dole and Ted Kennedy, and then later on, Vietnam veterans and congressmen like John Kerry and John McCain become very prominent voices on normalization. There is it's no mistake that when Clinton makes that announcement, he's stood flanked by Vietnam veterans serving in Congress. So what is the key policies here that I'm talking about? Of course, everyone in this audience is no doubt familiar that about 130,000 parolees evacuate alongside US personnel in April of 1975. That additional over 400,000 of the so-called boat people are resettled in the United States from camps throughout Southeast Asia via these multilateral international agreements in the late 70s and the late 80s. And then over another 500,000 come directly from Vietnam to the United States via an initiative called the Orderly Departure Program. And this program, which brings individuals directly from Vietnam to resettlement nations abroad, aimed to bypass the dangers of clandestine flight and stays in refugee camps. This includes sub-programs for Amerasians and re-education camp prisoners, both of which I'm happy to elaborate on a bit later. And what I argue in the book is that migration programs, which to this point in the historical record had not been featured prominently in at least the diplomatic initiatives and the accounting of missing American servicemen, individuals listed as prisoner of war missing in action, which of course is much more prominent in films like Rambo and Hollywood and US rhetoric, that US officials linked these concerns as humanitarian issues. So there are many, many other issues like the lasting effects of Agent Orange, to name only one possible example, that could have fallen under this umbrella. But when US officials vis-a-vis Vietnam after 1975 say humanitarian issues, they're talking about these still expansive, but also very specific concerns that privilege reunification for American and South Vietnamese families. And so one of the things I do in the book is I explore humanitarianism and human rights, not only as historical developments, but also as languages, as rhetorics of power in international relations and non-governmental advocacy. And I argue that in the domestic and international responses to the Indochinese diaspora, humanitarianism and human rights become intertwined in a lot of really interesting ways. Once again, perhaps we can elaborate on that a little bit later. So why, right? Always one of the key questions. To name just sort of one of the important takeaways from my research, I think that like the war years itself, there is a tendency to reduce the post-1975 period to a contest between Washington and Hanoi. And that doing so oversimplifies a very complicated story in which the South Vietnamese people play a very prominent role, in this case, not only as migrants, but as activists and important political power brokers in Washington, DC. Zooming out a bit more broadly beyond this case study of US-Vietnamese relations, examining the normalization process, as I do here, helps us better understand through larger transformations of the 20th century, each of which I've just touched on ever so briefly in these comments, but those are the reassertion of Congress and US foreign relations, changing domestic and international refugee norms, a shift much more broadly from resettlement to repatriation during this period. And in the US case specifically, a more, if not outright embrace, at least a willingness to endeavor into not only unilateral decisions regarding refugee resettlement, but also bilateral agreements and especially multilateral accords regarding refugee resettlement. And finally, as I just mentioned, the intertwining of humanitarianism and the human rights movement.